Welcome to Profiles of American History, where we look at notable people in American history that have often been disregarded or erased from the common narrative. Today we're going to be looking at La Malinche. Who was she? Well, she's a woman known by many names. Her other two most common names are Dona Marina and Malinalli. And views about her are very complicated. She has been called a savior, a villain, a lover, a betrayer, an evangelist, a helper, and the mother of a new race. In most cases, she has been disregarded due to her role in the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. Here is a quote about her. La Malinche was to become infamous in the history of Mexico. Not only did she turn her back on her own people, she joined the white men and became assimilated, serving as their guide and interpreter and generally assisting in the conquest. She was the first Mexican American. So this is obviously a negative view of La Malinche. We're going to dive into why people have this view of her and maybe why this is more of a limited view. So first, let's look at the time we're talking about. For historical context, this is the time in which Emperor Moctezuma was in charge of the dominant Aztec Empire, and his rule was brutal. He had a large empire, and in the areas in the remote regions, the people were often used as human sacrifices. And so his tyranny resulted in a lot of hatred and fear. And so when the Spanish came in to begin their conquest, the empire was especially vulnerable. La Malinche was born during this time. She was born in 1502 and originally named Malinal, also references Malinalli. She lived in more of the southwestern area of present-day Mexico, and she was the daughter of an Aztec chief. An interesting part about her history is that really led her to becoming having the influence that she did with Cortez was that because her father died and then her mother remarried. And then her mother and her stepfather had a baby, and it was a son. Now, because Malinalli was the rightful heir, but her mother and stepfather preferred their son, her mother actually sold her into slavery and declared her dead. And so it was through this action that Malinalli ended up living more on the Yucatan Peninsula with the Mayan peoples. And this led her to know the Aztec language, which was Nahuatl, and also to learn Mayan dialects. So when Hernan Cortez came to the Yucatan Peninsula, he took over the Mayan peoples, and in this exchange, he was gifted 20 maidens, and La Malinche was in this group, and her skill set was not known right away. Now, remember, she's only about somewhere between 15 and 17 years old at this time, and so her language, her knowledge of the language ended up becoming known over time, and she became a key interpreter and advisor to Cortez, really transcending gender roles at the time. She became known to the Aztec as La Lengua de los Dioses, the language of the gods. More personally, La Malinche was a lover of Cortez, and she bore him his first son named Martin after Cortez's father. This should show you that Cortez valued his relationship with La Malinche and would not have named his son after his father had it not been something, an honorable decision. This son, Martin, was likely not the first child born of Spanish and indigenous peoples, but was really the first recorded and well-known example. And so this has been said to spawn a new race known as the mestizo. Eventually, Cortez does have a legal marriage to a woman in Cuba. And so when she comes into the picture, La Malinche will be given in marriage honorably to one of Cortez's top soldiers. Of course, we say honorably. And eventually, at around 25 years old, she probably died of smallpox. So more importantly, what role did she play in the conquest? Bernal Diaz de Castillo is probably the most well-known historian to discuss her role. As Dona Marina proved herself such an excellent woman and good interpreter throughout the wars in New Spain, Tlaxcala, and Mexico, Dona Marina was a person of the greatest importance and was obeyed without question by the Indians throughout Spain. So what did she do? Well, her main role was in regards to language. She was able to communicate with other tribes in the area, other natives, to form a rebellion, to form alliances with the Spanish against the Aztec. She was able to convince these people, not just interpret on behalf of Cortez, but really convince and persuade them that the Spanish would free them, would liberate them from their subjugation from the Aztec. In another event, her relationship with community members helped to expose a plot, a surprise attack on Cortez and the Spanish. And Cortez was then able to launch a surprise attack of his own to combat that one. And so really, in instances, she saved the Spanish from total destruction. When Cortez does complete the conquest of Mexico, he says, "After God, we owe this conquest of New Spain to Dona Marina." So really emphasizing the role that she played in the Spanish conquest. So, La Malinche, Dona Marina, she was an interpreter, a liaison. She was an advisor of native customs and beliefs to aid the Spanish in their negotiations. She was a strategist. And least important, but most expected of women would have been her role as a mistress. So when thinking about this history, was she a traitor to her people? Did she turn her back? She did have times where she could have rejoined her people. Was she a traitor by allying with the Spanish and helping them in the conquest? Was she a treasonous puppet? Did she just go along with what they said? Should she be praised or condemned? These are questions that should be considered, but also put into historical context. She was able to transcend boundaries by woman. She was highly skilled and competent, and there were cultural beliefs about the Spanish and their inevitability of taking over, and her ability to really save herself and launch herself into a position of power should be considered. So, in an article written by Cordelia Candelaria, she describes La Malinche really as the feminist prototype. She says, "The fascinating story of this remarkable 16th century woman might be read as an account of the prototypical Chicana feminist. La Malinche embodies those personal characteristics, such as intelligence, adaptability, and leadership, which are most often associated with Mexican-American women, unfettered by traditional restraints against public achievement. By adapting to the historical circumstances thrust upon her, she defied traditional social expectations of a woman's role." So in reality, La Malinche is someone who should be known in history. She had an incredible role in the conquest of Mexico and the Aztec Empire, and her erasure in history is an example of the wider erasure of women, especially women of color, in U.S. history in general.